The Annunciation of Jesus in Luke is one of the most powerful stories in the whole of the tradition. Annunciation means announcement, and the telling of this story is then an announcement of Jesus' anticipated coming. I would suggest that it would be good to tell the story of either the prophecy of the birth of Ishmael. That story has more direct parallels to this one, but the other story of the announcement is the announcement of the birth of Isaac by the three men who come, and Abraham fixes everything and Sarah laughs when he announces it. It's a delightful story. And in the case of the Sarah story, it could be told because there is more contrast between these two stories, but it's also a delightful story. Either of these is the precedent in the traditions of the Hebrew Scriptures that provide the framework for this announcement to Mary. The translation of this as greetings, favored one, it's always ambiguous. The literal meaning of the word here is rejoice. Kaira. It means be happy. It is a way of saying hello, but it is more formal. It is the same word that Jesus says to the disciples after his resurrection, or it's to the women. When he meets them, he says, rejoice. The translation of greetings just doesn't get it in relation to the impact of this. It is, I've got good news for you. Whoopee, this is really good. However that is, you can translate it. It first of all means hello or hi. It's a greeting, but rather than saying greetings, which we don't say, I would suggest either hello or hi, and the Lord is with you. Now the question is, why was this a troubling greeting? And why was Mary troubled about this and wondered in her heart what this greeting might mean? Well, one reason is that when gods address young women, it's appropriate for the women in the ancient world to wonder what comes next. And that's because of the story of Leda and the swan, in which Zeus saw Leda and he came as a swan and had intercourse with her. And out of that, there was a birth. Well, given the associations that were present, because these stories were widely known and were widely told, it was fully appropriate for Mary to wonder, what does this greeting mean? And is this a prelude to a more intimate relationship? The angel Gabriel's response to her is profoundly comforting and consoling. Don't be afraid. And one of the things that means is, don't be afraid. I'm not going to rape you or something. That's one of the things that's in the background. It's never talked about, but I just want you to know that's one of the things that the listeners to this story in the ancient world would have understood. The angel's words here have the same structure as the angel's words in Genesis 16. And it's the same kind of angel. It's an angel who comes with a word of consolation, of hope, and at the same time, it is a voice that is very intimate. So don't tell this as a pronouncement by the angel, but rather as a word that is spoken intimately, quietly, lovingly, in order to assure and provide consolation for a woman who is prone to be very troubled because of what is happening. Now, Mary's response is translated, "How can this be, since I am a virgin?" That's not an inappropriate translation, but literally what it means is, Mary's response is, "How can this be, since I have not known a man?" This is the same phraseology that is used throughout the Old Testament to describe sexual intercourse. To know a woman, to know a man, is to have sex with them. So Mary's question is, in fact, more direct and more physically descriptive than the translation, "I'm a virgin." The angel's answer to Mary is, on the one hand, mysterious. The Holy Spirit will overshadow you. but it is also direct. That is, the Holy Spirit will come upon you, will overshadow you. Therefore, the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God. The issue of the way in which this story is told, then, is that what is happening here is a highly intimate relationship in which Gabriel is speaking to her about highly intimate sexual things, but it is done with, the conversation happens with both great dignity and with his speaking to her out of affection and honor rather than out of a spirit of either subordination or of violating her in some way. And that is one of the issues then that shapes how Mary's response at the end of the story is to be interpreted. Often this story is told with Mary responding at the end of the story with submission. And that is sometimes seen as her great virtue, is that she submitted to God's will in this way. But the spirit of submission is not the spirit of the women of Jesus' genealogy, nor is it appropriate in this story. So, for example, all of the women in the story, in the genealogy at the beginning of Matthew's Gospel, are women who were the very opposite of being submissive. They were women who took charge of their own life and of their own sexuality and used it as a way of seeing that something positive happened. So the women who are named are Tamar and Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba. Now, you could do a whole sermon on these four women. Tamar, who had been the wife of, 6 or 7 brothers, and they all died, and so the father didn't want any more of his kids, but she was determined to have a child, and so she put on the clothes of a prostitute and seduced him and got pregnant, and when he was going to have her killed because she had gotten pregnant without being married, she sent him all the things that he had given her, that is her father-in-law, Judah, and so he then acknowledged the child. And you know the stories of Rahab, who was the prostitute in Jericho, and then of Ruth, who was a Moabite, a foreigner who, the women got together and however it happened, she married Boaz, but she kind of seduced him on the threshing floor. And Bathsheba, who didn't seduce David, but she had a situation that she had to figure out what to do about. So she was clearly a very strong woman who then got her son Solomon to be David's successor. These are women who are the opposite of submissive. They are women who are determined to make something of their situation and to make a contribution to the history of salvation. Well, that's the way Mary is, and that's her legacy. Mary is, I think, strong and affirmative in response to the angel, not submissive. So when she says, "Here I am, let it be with me according to your word," she's not saying that in a spirit of, "Oh, here I am, oh, let it be as you say," but rather of, "Yes, all right, let's do it." It is not about, I submit to being used. It is rather, I affirm that what is happening here is the will of God for me. It's a very different way of telling the story. And it's very important in relation to how women's roles are understood and the implications of this for female sexuality, for the relationship with God, for the relationships between men and women. Now, there are many elements of this story that you can explore. So, for example, the appearance of angels in the traditions of Israel. This isn't a normal thing for angels to appear. But there are, for example, the angel, the messenger of God, appears at the burning bush to Moses. The great story of Balaam and his ass his donkey, where the donkey sees the angel and stops, and Balaam beats him over the head until finally the angel appears, and Balaam sees his sword and realizes that it was the donkey that was saving him. Other announcements of births to come, I've mentioned Ishmael and Isaac in Genesis 16 and 18. There's also the story of the announcement of the birth of Samson in Judges 13, 3-5. There are also the stories of angels commissioning people to tasks, of which the story of the angel in the burning bush in Exodus 3 is one. Also of Gideon in Judges 6. So what angels do is that they are sent by God to deliver important messages that are life transformative for those who hear them. It's always appropriate for people to be afraid when an angel appears, because you never know what the angel may do. So sometimes it is not good news, as is reflected in the story of Balaam. He almost got killed by the angel, and would have. Moses is afraid, takes off his sandals because he is afraid to look at God. After the appearance of the angel, Hagar says, how can this be? Have I looked at the face of God? Have I seen the face of God and lived? So the assumption was that if you looked at the face of God, you'd die. Well, that's the issue. That's part of the background of this story. Another set of stories that you might want to at least be familiar with are the stories of the conception of Alexander and Augustus in the traditions that were also present in the first century. And in each case, it is a story of that their mothers went into the temple of Apollo, and while they were asleep, that a snake came and wrapped itself around them, and then they were pregnant after that. So that they were then seen to be children of a god, sons of God. That became a basis for their claiming power, was that they had been chosen by God to be the sons of God, who would in turn exercise power. Well, Jesus is doing that. Luke is doing that about Jesus. But it is not about his becoming an emperor who exercised military power and conquered the world. It is rather of Jesus as the Spirit of God who transforms the world by the Spirit of his love and self-sacrifice for others. Another dimension of this story is the transformation of sexuality in the establishment of the intimacy of relationship between God and human beings. So Jesus' birth as a child of God is then also about the intimacy of relationship between God and people. That's probably the most important thing to convey in the way in which you both tell and interpret this story. It is the wonder of this conception, of Mary's character, that has been a constant source of inspiration throughout Christian history. And so to emphasize both the character of Mary, her courage, her strength, her faith, which in turn is reflected in the character of Jesus, her son. But it is also the spirit of this story. Now, you will see in the commentaries that there are places where people say that this is not in the response of the angel to Mary when she was troubled and wondered what this greeting might mean, that this is not about Mary's psychology, nor is there any sexual implication to the statement, the Holy Spirit will overshadow you. I understand why those things are said in relation to the doctrinal traditions in regard to this, but I do not think it is descriptive of what the listeners to this story would have understood because of the connections between this story and the other birth stories that were circulating around and were told in the ancient world. So both the stories in the Old Testament that are explicitly sexual, and also the stories of Alexander and Augustus, which were also, floating around in the culture. So the Jesus story stands in a rich and elusive relationship to these other birth stories. And it is a delightful story that also has all these implications in relation to how it is interpreted. So have a wonderful time telling and and preaching about this story.